During the
If
trial,
I may,
I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I apologize.
That's okay. I just want to explain that, that Vicki is not here this evening, okay? She's feeling a little discomfort in her chest, and we went to Shore Memorial, and they just want to run some tests tomorrow. We're not suspecting anything serious at this point, but
She in the hospital
keep her
now?
up first.
Is she in the hospital now?
Yeah, she is. She's keeping her overnight, just run some tests tomorrow. But
Okay.
I would like to open with just a word of prayer. if it's okay.
Please, go ahead.
Lord, we ask you to be with all of us tonight, be with our speaker as he provides us insights into you. Open our ears that we may hear, open our minds that we may understand, and open our hearts that we may love. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
So the question really that you were asking had to do with the issue of leadership historically in the Jewish community. And from a biblical perspective, we're dealing with a breakdown of people into tribal units, the sons of Jacob. And we know that one of the tribes was designated as the religious leaders of the community. That was the tribe of Levi. The third book of the Bible, Leviticus, is a tribe about how the Levites function and act. Well, the question was asked at the time of David, what was going on? Well, at the time of David, it was still structured that it was the Levites who ran the show at the temple in Jerusalem that was ultimately built by his son Solomon. Okay? That temple destroyed in 568 BCE by the Babylonians. There was a period of time known as the Babylonian exile when Jews who were living in the land of Israel were brought by the Babylonians in captivity to the town, into Babylon. 50 years later, the Babylonians don't exist anymore, and the Persians have taken over. The Persian model of empire building was that the people could go back and do whatever they choose. They weren't as dominant as the Babylonians had been to destroy the religious functioning of the temple. Well, when the people went back to, if you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they describe that post-destruction time period as prophets. That model of tribal continues until the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, 2000, 1900 and whatever, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. When the temple was destroyed, what we transitioned to in Jewish thought, practice, and leadership is the rabbinic model. If you are familiar with the Gospels, they describe that period using two terms for the Jewish leadership, Sadducees and Pharisees. Neither of them particularly kindly. It's a political entity. The book is political, we know that, because it's trying to differentiate between what had been the Jewish community and now was the growing Christian community. Nonetheless, those are lectures for other times and place. But with the transition to the rabbinic model, you no longer had to be part of the tribe of Levi to function in a religious capacity in the Jewish community. All individuals were empowered. The rabbis became the transmitters of the tradition and the leadership models. If one reads the Gospels carefully and you look at what is placed in Jesus' mouth, Jesus seems more to be part of the rabbinic model than of the priestly model of those who functioned in the sanctuary in Jerusalem during the lifetime. Now, one of the intriguing pieces of that, I'll take another minute and then I'll shut up and move to this. I've always had this conversations with people within the Catholic community and leadership where I've always been fascinated why, if in fact Jesus is more reflective of the rabbinic tradition, did the leadership model that gets selected becomes the priestly model? If that makes sense to you. The priestly model is, and you know it for those of you who are part of the Catholic community, the priest has unique roles in the distribution of sacraments, which are different from lay people. There is some movement away from that, but dominantly it's pretty still structured in that way. We also know that really up until 100 years ago or so, Catholics were not permitted to read the Bible. Okay, I don't know if most Protestants
We
know that.
learned Bible history.
Yes,
That was what we had, Bible history. The
You had the
Catholics
history,
taught Bible history.
but you didn't have the book.
No, we were not, no, we were
Okay.
Bible history.
So I think it was a host of reasons. One of them, of course, could have been that historically the role of the priest was enhanced by the fact that they had access to the material. And maybe because they were literate, they could read. Secondarily, there was the other thing, and I mentioned this to you, I think, last year, because I've always been fascinated by the way in which, I may have said it this year too, the way in which Scripture is presented in the church, and it's the Catholic and the Protestants also. And that is, there's a reading from the Old Testament, which I refer to, as you know, as the Jewish Bible. And then there's a reading from the New Testament, and it's another reflective of the political differentiation between old and new, which was meant to impart people's perceptions that the old was done, finished, and complete. Nonetheless, I always got a kick out of the idea that you read this, but nobody looks at it before them so they can understand it. They have to listen. Now the question of whether people listen is a good question. Okay, enough of this. All right. Thank you for your bravery last week when we discussed the issues of God, and I'm sure you've had some reflective thoughts in the week that we've passed. My ideas for the next few weeks are to kind of describe how we got to this point, how modernity has so changed what had been put in place in the past millennia. So tonight, we're actually going back to the 13th century, and you're going to learn an insight of the structure of how Europe functioned. Europe, which were countries at the time, little duchies and whatever, but also how the Jewish community was impacted during that time period as a way for you to understand the way that the Jewish community, oh, it's a train. The Jewish community is kind of a paradigm of what everybody is experiencing today. There are those who believe that what occurs to the Jewish people throughout history is a foreshadowing of what happens to others. Okay? So, what we're learning here is that King Boleslaw of Poland decides he wants to be part of the change in the world's economy. For those who remember taking American civilization in college, you learned about something that took place in the 12th, 13th century known as the rise of cities and towns, where all of a sudden people weren't just on farms, they were moving into what could be considered proto-cities, because economies started to be developed that weren't based on, here's my cow, here's my sheep, here's my goat, here's my fabric. Do you remember those books? I forgot what the names of those books were. The ones about building the cathedrals and all that stuff. Do you remember the books?
Pillars of the Earth.
Pillars of the Earth. They were great books and very insightful into kind of the dynamic model of how people lived during this time period. Nonetheless, John Boleslaw, wanting to be part of this new trend, decided that the best way for him to do that was to buy a cohort of Jews and have them come live in Poland. Why, you may ask? Well, the church, which was in power, did not permit Jews into certain occupations. They were restricted. So as a result, in many cases, Jews became the center layer between the barons and kings and the serfs below. So Jews became the collectors for taxes and were hated for it, of course, but the assumption was, oh, the Christians can't do this. We're not allowed to do it. We'll get the Jews to do it. And then, in fact, the Jews will be the ones who will be seen as the negative forces that are doing these things. Jews were also, because they couldn't be landed, and let's think for a second. You all studied this in 8th grade and maybe in college too. What was the economic system of the Middle Ages? Begins with an F. Feudalism. Well, feudalism was based on kings, knights, and serfs. Okay? But at the core of it all was the church. Because the church controlled it all. Which basically says anybody who isn't part of the church can't be part of the economic system. You are outside the system. And you have to think about that in terms of the Jewish populations of Europe that were never considered to be mainstream because they were the other. Okay. So Boleslaw decides he's going to grab 750 Jews from places in Germany to bring them in. And he gives them rights and privileges as part of the incentive to bringing them. And if you could read this, let me read it to you. Jews could read and write. They were highly educated. They were literate, ready to obey general education. Second, Jews were excellent as bankers because they had no choice, accountants, administrators who knew how to keep the economy healthy. So if you are moving out of an agrarian economy into a more economically based monetary economy, you need people who know how to do it. Years ago, in the course of some of my work internationally with the Israeli government and the State Department, I was in Jordan prior to the peace treaty with Israel. At that point, because of the Gulf War I, which had just expired, 250,000 Jordanians who had been working in the Gulf states were expelled. And they came back to Jordan because they had nowhere else to go. They were working in Kuwait and in Iraq as the bankers and the administrators and such. Many of them had been trained here in the United States under what was known as Rotary scholarships. Any of you in the Rotary? The Rotary was very big in providing Arab Christians education in the United States. They went back. Okay, it's the same story, but just with different people of different faith. So here we move on. And this charter states that the testimony of the Christian alone may not be admitted in a matter which concerns the money or property of a Jew. In every such instance, there must be testimony of both a Christian and a Jew. If a Christian injures a Jew in any way, the accused shall pay a fine to the royal treasury. I want you to listen to these very carefully because there's an incredible contradiction. If a Christian desecrates or defiles a Jewish cemetery in any way, it is our wish that he be punished severely as demanded by law. If a Christian should attack a Jew, the Christian shall be punished as required by the laws of this land. We absolutely forbid anyone to accuse the Jews in our domain of using the blood of human beings. We'll get to that. We affirm that if any Jew cry out in the night as a result of violence done to him, and if his Christian neighbors fail to respond to his cries and do nothing to bring the necessary help, they shall be fined. We also affirm that Jews are free to buy and sell all manner of things just as Christians, and if anyone hampers them, he shall pay a fine. This is revolutionary, because you must remember that in Europe at the time and for the next 500 years after that, Jews had no access to civil courts. The Jews were outside of the society by design because they couldn't be part of the feudal system. Now, that thing about drinking blood, any of you familiar with that as what's known as a blood libel? Christians have not always been very kind to Jews, okay? And one of the claims were that Jews killed Christian children before Passover to take their blood to make matzah. This was said as recently as a few years ago in Alabama or in Mississippi. Do any of you ever read the books by, oh my God, he wrote The Fixer and Malamud. Did you ever read the books by Malamud? There's a book called The Fixer where he talks of the story of Mendel Baylis. Mendel Baylis was a Russian, this is a true story, accused of a blood libel in the 1920s, 1913s, for having killed a child. Now, of course, it wasn't true. It was part of this negative fantasy. So the idea that Boleslaw in the charter had already awareness that this was a claim that was not unique or outside the realm of continual thought is amazing. But the rights that are described here, which seem like normal kinds of courtesies to people who live in the country, are totally unknown in the rest of Europe at this time. Let's go on. And this is part of what the story is. These are the expulsion of Jews and Jewish communities from 1012 to 1891. Now, you could ask, why were the Jews expelled? There are many reasons. Some of them are very obvious. In the case of Spain, it was because Jewish individuals had provided the funding for the Spanish monarchy, and if you don't want to pay your debt, you just expel the community. Interesting side fact. When Columbus sailed in 1492, oh, we just had Columbus Day. There was a gentleman on the ship whose name was Jose Moses, who spoke Hebrew. He was Jewish. And why was he on the ship? Because the assumption was, if there are any other places that they're going to land, because I mean, you think about the risks they took in the way in which they understood the world. The assumption was the people there had to be part of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and they would speak Hebrew. Fascinating. There's also those rumors that Columbus himself was Jewish. Well, look, we have to remember that at this time, let's think about Spain. The Moors conquered Spain from North Africa in the 7th century and imposed Islam in Spain. It was a time when there was actually exceptionally good relations between the indigenous Jewish community of Spain and the Muslims. There was a lot of incredible synergy that took place. For those of you who studied Spanish history, you know about the Reconquista, when Spain reclaimed itself and became independent again with the leadership from Aragon. We know that in 1390, 1901, Jews were expelled from Portugal. But at the same time, there was this incredible thing going on called the Inquisition. Okay? And at the core of it, the role of the Inquisition was to root out people who had chosen to become Catholic, but were suspect for not really being Catholic. There were Jews known as Nuevos Conversos, for those who speak Spanish. But there was also another name that was used, and that was Marrano. And Marrano was a pig. Those were those Jews who had chosen to become Catholic because of the pressure placed upon them. And in some cases, they were doing it just for survival and were practicing in private. I don't think all of them really were. But the Inquisition's role was to root them out, kind of like McCarthy in 1954 to look for communists in America. It's very serious. Okay. So these are the various expulsions that take place. These are the descriptions of what took place. And during this time period, we have a phenomena that takes place initially in Venice. Those of you who've been to Venice? Okay. And you know Venice is on these little islands that are there and whatever else. Well, the Doge in the 13th century decided that all the Jews who were living among everybody else should be taken and placed in one particular area. Well, there had been a metal foundry on one of the smaller islands, and they moved it to a bigger island because they needed more production. So they decided they would place all of the Jews from Venice on this island. The Italian for a foundry is getto. There you have the origin of the term, which has been used both generically and specifically, the term of a ghetto. Done to segregate Jews out and became a pattern throughout Europe. Okay. I don't need to go through all of these things. These are all the expulsions.
All right, so I just want to be clear, if I could just ask you. Italians made up the ghetto?
They didn't make it up. They didn't make it up. They started the process, and the name for it came from what had been on the island prior, which was an iron foundry. So it was like, you know, that's AC down the road, so it would be like we call that AC, and that became the place where all the whatever lived. Okay? But a ghetto is an iron foundry in Italian. Okay, so if you look at this map, you can see where Jews, over the course of centuries, were emancipated. Now, what do you think emancipation means? Well, you know, when a kid emancipates themselves from their parents, the assumption is that they have cut off all the connection or responsibility that their parents may or may not have. Emancipation, and we're going to be discussing this week and next week, has to do with the idea of being potentially given the rights of being part of whatever the outside society is. It will become questionable whether it actually occurred or not. But these are the various places, and they start with the French Revolution in 1789. Forget about the United States for now. What do we remember from our study regarding the French Revolution? What were the core three principles? You're on the right track. Fraternity, equality, okay, and liberté. Fraternity, equality, liberté. Beautiful. Except there's a challenge that takes place, and that is, whereas the feudal system had been the knights, the kings, and the serfs, makes perfect sense that all of a sudden Napoleon is allowing the lowest classes of the French culture to now be viewed as citizens. You've seen those movies Citizen Francois. So, you know, you also that play, what's that? Les Mis, or you've seen those movies, you know, where everybody's getting their head chopped off, but they're all calling themselves citizen whatever. Well, guess what? There were Jews in France, and they've been there for a long time, and now all of a sudden Napoleon is faced with this idea, what do I do with them? Can they be citizens? This is the dilemma of the modern world. So religious emancipation. Napoleon emancipates Jews and Friends, you're part of the crew, as well as Protestants in Catholic countries and Catholics in Protestant countries. He believed emancipation would benefit France by attracting Jews to live into the country given the restrictions they faced elsewhere. I will never accept any proposal that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country. And you have to understand, absolutely revolutionary to be claiming this. He was seen as so favorable to the Jews that the Russian Orthodox Church formally condemned him as, quote, Antichrist and the enemy of God. You have to understand how incredibly insidious and continuous all of this has been. It gives you an insight into some of the behaviors that we still see today. Because this is not new. This has been in the DNA and the culture and in the drinking water for 2,000 years. So, these are some of the changes that the French brought about. And remember, Napoleon just didn't take over France. He took over all of Europe, basically. But he also did something else which was unique, which really brings a lot of this into perspective. As I said to you, feudalism is dead. But with that came the total break between the church's control of government and society. We start to have what becomes, in a positive way, secularization, the separation of church and state. You remember that in the old days, 1,200 years before this, 1,100 years before this, we had this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, where Constantine takes on Catholicism and brings it in as the power of the Roman Empire and the Church, which creates all kinds of challenges for other lectures. Nonetheless, we have a term known as Caesaropapism, where there is this dual relationship between the Caesars and the popes. And as every one of my history professors would always claim, they never created it, but they would always say, the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't holy, and it wasn't Roman, but it certainly was an empire. And there's no doubt that it was. Okay. So, I'm just going to flash through this because Judaism gets influenced by the changing model. And this is where we start to get terminologies like Reform Jews, and then 100 years later, conservative Jews, and then we get something known as Orthodox Jews. That is a product of modernity and the changing climate that takes place in Europe. Let me do it very simply. And you're going to see it here, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's in my head. As Jews were given the opportunity to move out of the ghettos into the mainstream, which is a lovely hope. It doesn't always happen like that, but it was the expectation. The Jewish community, as a totality, broke into segments. I don't want to be part of that other world. I'm going to stay separate. If the ghetto walls are gone, I'm going to create my own. That became what is known as modern Orthodoxy. You can look at the Amish, who did the same thing, the Shakers, who did the same thing, the Mormons, who did the same thing. They didn't want to be tainted by any other aspect of any other culture. The first to kind of break out were those who were looking to reform Judaism, to find a way for people to maintain their Jewish identity and beliefs and practices and still be able to live in the modern world, caught between the two. In the 1860s, a movement known as conservative Judaism started because they wanted to conserve Judaism from what they believed to be the excesses of the Reform communities and the Orthodox communities. Okay? Which leads us to today, where hopefully this will absolve the confusion about those terms. In many ways, the Reform movement and the conservative movement are much closer in identities today than they were in the past. The Orthodox community is as fragmented and multifaceted as it's always been. Whereas the Orthodox and the conservative movement are structured with congregational bodies, with seminaries, the Orthodox community is totally diverse. There are 50, 60, 100 different variations within the Orthodox community. The Catholic community, in some ways, shares that same thing, though the Roman Church tries to think that it is the universal and it's everybody. But even in the Roman Church, there are huge variations that exist. Look at the variations of the Protestant community, okay? And the fact that we now have non-branded Protestants, or non-branded churches, you know, My Father's Place, the Respite House, you know, God's Tent, whatever, the Tabernacle. There are all these places that don't affiliate with what used to be national organizations or international organizations that meant something. Okay? Let me go on. Okay. Napoleon did not pose a set of questions to Protestants before granting them citizenship. The French Revolution had already established the principle of religious freedom, and under Napoleon, Protestants were formally recognized and integrated into French society without special additions. Instead, Napoleon's policy towards Protestants focused on state oversight and institutional recognition through the Organic Articles of 1802. The specific line of questioning in Special Assembly was a process that Napoleon used to address the concerns and integration of the Jewish population, not the Protestants. It's a terrible story, okay? In 1980, I went to Poland 2 days after martial law was lifted. You know, the Poles are a unique group of individuals who have had a really tragic history. But nonetheless, with Lech Walesa, if you remember from the Solidarity movement, which was threatening the Russian hold on Poland. And one of the tragedies was that the Roman Church in Poland sided with the Russians for fear of civil war, whether that was the right decision or not. Nonetheless, I came in 2 days after martial law was lifted to observe what was being planned for the commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which the Polish government was engaged in. And, you know, there were terrible scarcities at that time. And there were scarcities in Russia also, where people would get on bread lines or meat lines at 2 o'clock in the morning and wait and wait and wait, and ultimately either get very little or nothing. But of course, the story started off that everybody's in line at a butcher, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, the butcher comes out and says, all Jews online, you can leave. Okay. The rest of the people are standing there. 5 hours later, 8 o'clock in the morning, the butcher comes out and says, you can all leave, there's nothing for you. These people turn to each other and say, you see those Jews, they always get preferential treatment. Okay. So the Protestants didn't have to go through. Okay. Before Napoleon, Protestants had been persecuted in France with their rights restricted and Protestantism largely outlawed. The French Revolution began the process of ending this persecution. Formal recognition after coming to power, Napoleon's government negotiated. Were you aware of this? Oh, good. I'm so glad I could bring this stuff to you. It's so important that you understand where you guys have come from and where we guys have come from. And in some ways, the parallels are fantastic. So Napoleon, in 1806, convenes a group of Jewish leaders known as the Assembly of Notables, because he's faced with this challenge. What do I do with the Jews? The Protestants, it was easy, they're Christians. They know how to say Jesus, okay? They might sing more than us, but we're okay. But these Jews, they've been the aliens up until this time. The Jewish community of Europe, some of whom were there 2,000 years ago, certainly maybe more in Italy, were viewed as resident aliens.
Resident what?
Aliens. In what we used to refer to as aliens, as opposed to The Walking Dead and all that other kind of stuff. All right. So he calls the Council of Notables, and he brings these questions to this group. Is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? If divorce is valid, although pronounced not by the courts but by justice, by the virtue of laws in contradiction to the French code. Do you want me to do each one of these individually or all together? What would you rather? Okay. Is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? We weren't Mormons, okay? Now, think about what that is telling you about how the French leadership knew and what they didn't know about Jews. Jews were so outside of the realm of their existence and awareness that they had to ask that, because in the Bible, there were people who had more than one wife, and there were no Mormons around at this time to kind of fill that in. Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? That's a valid question to ask. May a Jew marry a Christian? Or may a Jew marry a Christian woman? Or does Jewish law order that the Jews should only intermarry among themselves? Well, I understand the purpose of that question. And the issue has really been resolved maybe 150 years ago by the advent of civil marriage. When we talk about marriage in Christianity and Judaism, we have two very different models. And let me spend the time, and I don't know if we'll ever get through all this stuff, but I hope you're having fun. Okay?
Yes.
Okay. If I say the following to you, I will then explain it. Christianity is a religion of individuals. Judaism is a religion of families. And I will explain what that means. No one is born a Christian. The only way that someone becomes a Christian is through the act of baptism, which creates some of the political dilemma over the battle about abortion. Because, and I'm going off on a tangent, but who cares? Because the issue was, if this is an unbaptized soul, and you should be aware that the Catholic community has struggled with the idea of abortion for a couple of thousand years. Their first position was following the Roman law, which said you could do whatever you want up until the 40th day when it quickened. At a later point in time, the Catholic community adopted an idea that abortion conceals sin. You remember that book, The Scarlet Letter?
Yep.
Well, if you could have sex and you could have an abortion, nobody knew you had sex, and you can't have sex, okay? Christianity has a rather uniquely challenged view of sexuality and sex. Let's just leave it there. Okay. In Judaism, the child born of a Jewish mother is Jewish. Even to the point, if the woman had become Jewish prior to giving birth, the child is automatically Jewish. Okay? In the issue concerning abortion, and the Catholic Church used to have this thing called purgatory, which they now call limbo. I thought that was something that you did in the islands.
That was unbaptized babies.
That's
what
right.
we're told.
Right, okay. Well, here's where
Unbaptized people.
here's the problem. And here are the two kind of, I do medical ethics too, but here are the two medical ethics dilemmas. A Catholic woman is about to give birth and is in distress caused by the potential delivery and is in a Catholic hospital. We must make this. The decision will be made to save the child because the mother has already been baptized, which has also created the following instrument known as an intrauterine baptismal syringe, where that it was not uncommon in Catholic hospitals, a lot of which don't exist anymore, that in that circumstance they would baptize this embryo, whatever you want to call it, and create that as being baptized in the uterine before birth. Now, the other piece that we have to deal with has to do with this old model, which is still in existence, they just changed the name, of what happens to that thing at that point. So, the Catholic Church has every right, and I tell my students this at the seminary, to have whatever position they want concerning when they believe life begins. The current model, that is the operative model in the Catholic community, that life begins when a sperm and an egg unite, is relatively new in Catholic thought. 1850s, 1840s, it becomes the normative model and the absolute decision-making goal in Catholic thought. The Jewish community, and it goes back to a description in the book of, I believe it was Numbers, where if two men are fighting and a pregnant woman is there and she is hit by the men fighting, the men owe her damages for what took place. It is not killing. An embryo in Jewish tradition is not viewed as a pre-existent life. It is a potential life. And let me explain how that plays out. In the case where this pregnancy is causing the potential death of the mother, it is permissible to end it for the sake of the mother. Because the mother either has children that she should care for or has the potential of having more children, which is absolutely the mirror image or the negative image of how the Catholic community functions with it. It's even to the point where 2,000 years ago, during the rabbinic period, it stated the following principle. If in the course of delivery, this thing is causing the potential death of the mother,
The child, by the way, it's not a thing.
it is not a child until it is born according to Jewish tradition. Until a head appears in the birth canal and it is breathing. You may have your own ideas, that's fine. But Jewish,
You're talking mostly Christians here. So.
I understand.
Okay.
You know what, I'm not fighting with you, I just want to clarify, okay?
Call it a potential child, if you wish.
Okay.
Thank you.
The Jewish community 2,000 years ago said that if this was taking place, it was permissible to go in and break it up and remove it, which I guess could be considered to be what people call today a late-term abortion. Okay. Now, having said all of this, though abortion is permitted in Jewish practice and tradition, from the Orthodox through the Reform, it is not to be used as a means of birth control, okay? Because it is a potential life. But it is viewed during a pregnancy to be the same as an intestine or a liver or an appendix that is part of the organs of the woman until, once again, a head appears in a birth canal and it is breathing, which in essence means it is a discrete other human entity. Okay, it's just difference of perspective. Okay, and as I've said to my students in the seminary, and I'm going to repeat myself, you have every right, the Catholic Church has every right to set up with its own definitions of how it views any of this. Where I have a conflict is when you attempt to make that public policy for everyone in a society who don't necessarily agree or believe the same thing, that should be the normative way. You know that the Episcopalian Church permits abortion. The Protestant community is okay. Okay, let me go on. So, in the eyes of the Jews, are Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion considered as brethren or as strangers? It kind of reflects the idea that you have two people who don't have a clue who they know each other as. But it's an important question to ask. You know, when the Pope met with the Jewish community, the first Pope to do it, he said, "I am Joseph, your brother." Such a beautiful thing to say. You know, because in essence, we had two separate, parallel existences going on. What conduct does Jewish law prescribe towards Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion? Concerned. In 1807, they called people back together again. Do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens acknowledge France as their country? Why do you have to ask that question? Because the assumption was they were resident aliens in Europe, that they were there even for 1,000 or 2,000 years, but their goal was to be citizens of Israel, and that's really where they were looking to go back to. So how can you be loyal to a country? Can you be loyal? That's happened here in the United States too. Okay? We've done that not just with Jews, but certainly in more recent time, there's been that about the Muslim community and other foreign groups in the way in which we have viewed the other. Okay. So, in Jewish tradition, and I'll go back to the Babylonian exile that I talked to you about after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, Jews go to Babylonia, and they're living there. And they create a principle known as Dina de Mechulta Dina. The law of the land is the law. Which means that if the Jews are permitted to be under the umbrella of whatever the civil practice is of the country that they're living in, and it is not in conflict or contradiction to Jewish practice, we're fine. During the Middle Ages, when Jews were living in the ghettos and were not under the protection of Christian courts and had no standing in Christian courts, Jewish practice, which was not only religious, also had a civil aspect to it, and they implemented it by what were known as rabbinic courts who made decisions. Example, somebody comes to one of your houses, I won't say which, and they trip on your steps. Well, they go to court and they sue you, okay? If that happened in the ghetto in France or in Mons or in Warsaw, they couldn't go to the church courts. They dealt with it within their own community. But the answer was, and here and universally was, if those laws are not in conflict with the same principles that we function with, we withdraw that part of our practice model and are gladly under your civil rule. Who elects the rabbis? Well, they were aware of how the church functioned, and therefore they thought it was the same. Nobody really elects the rabbis. The rabbis come out of seminaries. At that point, they weren't, shall we say, certified by the Mid-Atlantic states the way they are today. But they graduated a particular seminary, they received their ordination documents, and a congregation made a decision about who they were going to engage, which is also different than what happens certainly in the Catholic community, where the bishop sends a priest and you got it, okay? Or the Episcopal Church, you can apply for a job and then the individual vestry, and I guess it would be the same here, would make a decision about who they would engage. In the Episcopal Church, when they appoint a rector, that person is there for as long as they choose to be there unless they do something really stupid. Okay? And that's happened certainly in a lot of places. Okay. What kind of police jurisdiction do the rabbis exercise over the Jews? Not much. Rabbis are put in a position to determine and make decisions, but ultimately, just like in all of our lives, you can either accept them or reject them, right? Okay. Are there professions from which the Jews are excluded by their law? Does Jewish law forbid the Jews to take usury from their brethren? Does it forbid or does it allow usury in dealings with strangers? You know where that comes from. That comes from the Christians' view of what they couldn't do in the way they understood. So here are the answers. Polygamy is forbidden. Divorce by Jewish law is valid only after a previous decision of the civil authorities. One of the things that we have forgotten, certainly in America, was that up until the advent of civil marriage, which was run by the state, all marriages took place in religious settings. There were no other options. Divorce was also an unknown. Divorce became part of American society, ironically, after the Civil War. And the reason for that was women claiming survivor benefits from the government to prove that they were actually married to the soldiers who died. It's a very interesting kind of a reflection on culture and society. So, divorce, the religious act of marriage must be preceded by a civil contract, which means that if we are given the rights of citizenship, a Jewish marriage requires a civil marriage to take place. In other words, I'm going to do a wedding Saturday night for two kids that I've known since one was 5 and the other was 4. And it's a second marriage for both of them, and it's just wonderful they found each other. But I can't legally do the wedding until I sign a state marriage license. I don't see that as my primary responsibility, but it is a legal requirement. Now, many of you are familiar with some of the silliness that goes on in Florida. Susie meets Harry, and they both have Social Security, and they want to live together. And they either go to the minister or the priest, and they say, we can't get married, because if we get married, then my benefits go down, and then I can't do this. Could you do something for us? Okay? It's more common than you could believe. Okay. Marriages contracted between Jews and Christians are binding, though they cannot be celebrated with religious forms. Okay? It's not that different today. Every Israelite is religiously bound to consider his non-Jewish fellow as a citizen and as brothers, and so on. That the Israelite is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland and shall love and defend it when called upon. You know, that statement is one of the great ironies. During the 20th century, the early 20th century, when the Nazis came to power in Germany, there are so many photographs and stories of Jews who fought for the Kaiser in World War I, who are now horrified by the fact that the country that they supported and died for had now turned them into aliens. Judaism does not forbid any kind of handicraft or occupation. It is commendable for Israelites to engage in agriculture, manual labor, the arts, as their ancestors did in Israel. Finally, Israelites are forbidden to exact usury from Jew or Christian. Okay. So, what we've learned so far, oh my God, and I had a whole other one to do.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
You want to keep going?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. You get to see all my stuff. Okay. Okay. So, you saw this slide before about expulsions that took place. This is merely just a refresher to look at. Those were the emancipations. That was the artwork of this great Napoleonic moment when he calls together the Grand Sanhedrin. But look at this. Angry anti-Jewish caricature parodied Jewish emancipation in Europe, suggesting that Jews expected their newfound liberties to allow them to profit even further at the expense of Christians. Do you see a trend? Okay? What we are dealing with is an incredibly invested cultural perception that even though emancipation is so powerful and important, we are dealing with centuries of beliefs and practices that are very hard and almost impossible to change. So emancipation creates new isms in Europe. Liberalism, the belief in the importance of liberty and equal rights, espouse a wide array of views depending on their understanding of the principles such as constitutionalism, liberal democracy, free and fair elections. What you're seeing here has taken, it's universal. It's in totality about what's taking place as a result of this cataclysmic change in culture and society that Napoleon brings about throughout Europe. We're still fighting the aftermath. Conservatism. established during the French Revolution, a political and social philosophy that promotes the maintenance of traditional institutions and supports, gave an ideology that people could follow and believe in. There are many people today who consider themselves to be conservatives here in the United States, when in reality they are not conservatives at all. Okay, you need to go back to Bill Buckley to understand what it meant to be a conservative in American culture and society. Socialism, an economic system characterized by social ownership or control of the means of production and cooperative management of the economy, political philosophy that influenced people to advocate a different type of system. You use the term in America today and people want to chop your head off, okay? You know, it's always fun when people would rail about, don't screw around with my Medicare or my Social Security. But I'm a conservative, okay? Both of those programs are really reflective of the best of what socialism could be. It's not such a nasty term. Marxism, an economic and socio-political worldview and method of socioeconomic inquiry that centers upon a materialistic interpretation of history, and certainly very different. Marxism becomes communism and so on and so forth. That's different. Nationalism, a political ideology that involves a strong identification of a group of individuals with a political entity defined in national terms, gave nations a belief that a people must be autonomous, united, and express a single national culture. We're facing some of that, okay? But nationalism in Europe becomes very, very critical in the last part of the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century, and is even now part of the struggle that's going on between the nature of the indigenous populations and the migrant populations, which are dominantly Muslim, that have come into Europe because there are no people to take the jobs, because there's no population, and that's who's done it. Romanticism, artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in the second half of the 18th century. The revolutions of 1848, series of resolutions, Communist Manifesto, a short publication written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Okay. So now we get, how do you react to freedom? And even though it is uniquely our story of the Jewish community, it is also the story in many ways of the Protestant community in France, which has now been recognized, and others who were not part of the mainstream. So the question really is, with the ghetto walls not there, how do Jews and Judaism survive? Maybe they don't. Maybe emancipation actually means assimilation. Do you know the difference between assimilation and acculturation in sociological terms? Assimilation means you become what the other is. Acculturation has to do with the idea that you bring your culture into constant awareness in the culture, but don't offend it. I wanted to say something else. I have to think about what I was going to say. Okay. During the 18th century tradition, Jewish society underwent a cultural crisis because of a process of fragmentation, the main symptom of which was the decline of rabbinic authority. The attempt to find an answer to this crisis led to the formation of various competing movements. And these are just a reflection of some of those various movements. I wish I could remember what I was saying. Okay. So, how do you live with freedom? It's a question that each of us face every single day. It's a question that our children face. It's a question that is part of the nature of living in this kind of a culture and society. And I remember what I was going to say to you. There is a difference between tolerance and pluralism. I'm a great fan of pluralism. When we went to school, everyone in this room, you were taught about the great melting pot theory of America. Okay? It's what they taught us. But who controlled what the melting pot was? What were you supposed to come out as? Probably Protestant, white, and smiley. Okay? Pluralism says we need to not just tolerate each other, we need to be accepting of each other, and that our culture is better off by the diversity that we have within it, as long as we all play by the same rules. Pluralism is a value that I support and would hope would become part of the culture in the country that we live in. Because there are aspects that are truly pulling us apart. Okay, so how do you maintain an identity without the ghetto to protect your identity, even though it was so negative that you were segregated outside of the mainstream of the culture? So you either try to rebuild the walls, or in many cases, people became Christians. Because that's how they assumed they would not be singled out. It's the same thing today when we did one of our lectures where we talked about people who are nuns, N-O-N-E-S's.
Yes.
Okay? So, in America today, some of the forming of people is to become nothings. I live here. I'm not religious. I don't have a culture. I don't have an ethnicity. I'm here. I don't even want to use the term that I'm an American, because in some ways I'm embarrassed by the two. I mean, it's not me, okay? This is now going to be lists of names that you can't see of people during the 19th century, Jews of prominent position who chose to become Christian, because that's how, oh no, the list goes on, there are thousands. That's how they decided they could remove this stigma of being Jewish in a culture that was unaccepting and rejecting of Jews. The list continues. On the list, you're also going to see Karl Marx is one of those people. Okay. We keep going. The list, and I am only showing you a part of it. Now here's one of the most interesting ones. You can read that. On February 23rd, 1897, realizing that with Hanslick's active and Brahms' tacit support, he actually had a chance of getting the job. Mahler converted to Catholicism and was baptized at Kleinenkerschule in Hamburg. Immediately told his friend Ludwig Karpat, "I do not hide the truth from you when I say that this action, which I took from self-preservation and which I was fully disposed to take, has nevertheless cost me a great deal." Heine, who also converted to Christianity, has famously cited baptism as the ticket for admission to Gentile society. The timing and disclosure of Mahler's intention was apparently calculated to keep the world of friends and perhaps of gossip from learning that the step was imminent, but at the same time to suggest to the officials in Vienna that he had undergone baptism earlier for its own sake and not just to become eligible to fill the vacancy. What are we talking about? Mahler, who was an incredible conductor and a composer of some renown, wanted to become head of the Vienna Symphony, but he couldn't because he wasn't Catholic. So he walked in a church. 5 minutes later he walked out, he was Catholic, he got the job. We have to understand what was going on in Europe. And we should also realize that that was not unheard of here in the United
I was
States.
just going to say, our parents didn't want to speak the languages of our grandparents, And we were all, and like, I don't know how to speak German, but they all spoke German and
Right.
Polish and how, like,
Right.
yeah, like, it's a shame, we are a melting pot, but we can, literally, a lot of us can only speak one language, we should be allowed to speak all
But you see, but pluralism
of them. Yeah,
would have provided you to learn everything about your culture, to be
That's
able to
right.
speak that culture and not be either embarrassed, because they wanted you to be a melting pot person, and just like every other person in America.
yeah, we're exactly what you described, smiling, white, and, proud.
That's right. Well, there you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Wasp, the wasp.
Right, buzzing around.
That's right. Well, that didn't allow for people of color
Right.
to even be part of a culture, and we certainly had a very separated culture for a very long time. Okay. For some Jews, the efforts to integrate led to the surrender of Judaism and to the conversion to Christianity, the phenomena that went hand in hand with the fashion during the Romantic era of converting to Catholicism. In actual fact, the so-called baptism epidemic began at the turn of the 18th century and led to about 1/10 of Prussian Jews to become Catholics. Although baptism solved some practical problems, such transformations obviously complicated relationships within families and between friends. Nevertheless, moving forward into the 19th century, ambitious Jewish families were more frequently choosing this future for themselves and for their children. Does the name Rothschild mean anything to you? Very prominent French family. The men were required to marry Jewish women so that they have Jewish children. The women were allowed to marry Christians because the children would be Jewish because they were women. Despite many differences, they shared a common characteristic: the rejection of any notion of a return to the ghetto and striving for a reformation of Jewish identity, which also included a dialogue with non-Jews. Some Jewish converts to Christianity were very famous. Look at Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister, Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine. Everywhere the Jews of the proponents of the Haskalah, which was the Enlightenment, to lead Jews out of religious ghetto, to integrate the Jewish world into the non-Jewish world, to bring separation to an end. Conversion became a perception of normative reaction. Did any of you ever see a movie that was around probably 25 years ago called Bread and Chocolate? It was before the EU really coming into its totality in Europe. And it's the story of an Italian man who can't find work to feed his family in Italy. So he goes to Switzerland and works in a cafe. But as he's working there, he starts to feel very much the outsider because he looks different. So he dyes his hair blonde in order to fit in. But the story reflects the ethnocentricity of European society and culture. You're a Frenchman, you're an Italian, you're a Swiss, you're a German, whatever you might be. And those countries, in many ways, have not given up on a lot of that. And that causes the issues that are going on, certainly in France today, with a huge Muslim population. The distinction, as opposed to when you travel to England, is that Muslim populations live on the rings outside of center Paris. They are separate. In England, it's taken over downtown if you go to England these days. And one of the challenges, which is not getting resolved, is whereas people came to the United States from somewhere else and they wanted to be part of America. So they integrated And part of the challenge that we're facing today is people saying, if you live here, you should speak English. Okay? We shouldn't have driver's licenses in Spanish or whatever it is. In England and in Europe, what we're facing is a very obvious other population that isn't choosing to integrate into the mainstream of whatever that culture is. Remember when there was the controversy in France over McDonald's about whether they could call it French fries or
Yes,
home
right.
frites? That's just a little example of some of this challenge that they face internally. Okay. Immigration and the pull of assimilation. Almost 3 million Jews immigrated from Europe to the United States over a 70-year period. Due to a combination of factors including hope for a better opportunity associated with assimilation into non-Jewish communities in other countries, particularly among the upper classes. Let's remember how discreetly unique the United States really is and should continue to be. And that is, all of us came here. Even though my family came here in 1881, they still came here, okay? And think about how we treated the people who actually lived here before we did, okay? Okay, so Israel Jacobson in 1810 starts to try and develop a model that will permit living in both of these cultures and society, and he becomes known as the beginner of reforming Judaism to be able to live in the modern world. The new broad-mindedness went so far that Jews were even accepted in society as long as they were not too Jewish. As long as they didn't dress too differently, behave too differently, eat a different diet, or insist on wearing old-fashioned religion on their sleeves. It's something we can understand, okay? In the 1950s, there was a study done, a sociological study, a huge study done here in the United States. And a Jewish sociologist named Marshall Sklar tried to do a parallel study of the American Jewish community. 10 years later, or 8 years later, he tried to do this study again, and he found that his survey questions from the period before had no resonance in people looking at them. The only question they could relate to was, when you have people in your home for dinner, who are they? Remember that dietary laws for Jews were a restrictive model where they didn't go to restaurants. Now, anybody, what do you do with your life? You don't go to movies, you go to restaurants, right? And because of kosher, people ate in their homes. Now, in a lot of ways, that's changed dramatically. What's ironic is that in the state of Israel, all the supermarkets, for the most part, well, all the supermarkets, there are non-kosher butchers, but there are supermarkets where all the food you buy is kosher. So even if people aren't religious, they're eating kosher food. They may not be preparing it that way. What's an ironic piece is that there are pigs that are raised in the state of Israel, but they are raised on slats, of wooden slats, so their feet don't touch the soil of the state. Okay. We're very clever.
Like chaos.
Okay, these are some of the accomplishments of the evolution of reforming Judaism. You can't read it, it doesn't really matter. The rise of the Jewish Enlightenment movement promoted integration into European society and the adoption of secular education and values. This contributed to a growing number of Jews who identified as Jews of no religion. I want you to think about that as a paradigm of what's happening in this United States with the totality of the population. As a way to become more mainstream, people believe they have to drop their uniqueness or their identities that may or may not have defined them.
So the question is Jewish a race or a religion?
Well, I think we'd like to use the term people, okay? I don't think we've ever been a race, though the Nazis tried to make racial theory the normative model. Judaism, you know, you're asking a very interesting question.
Because it's all about perception.
It is about perception, but it's also the way one builds identity, okay? In the United States, religion, which is dominantly Christian, has been viewed as Christianity is religion. It is not identity or people, okay? So I used to be part of a study group of priests when I was a rabbi in Rochester. And I went in to see one of our meetings one day, and there had been a terrorist shooting at a Catholic church in Islamabad. And I said, you guys must be really upset. Oh, that's politics. And I said, well, you know, in parallel, when they bombed the Jewish Community Center in Argentina, we were on planes flying down to bring support and help to the community. Now, remember, there are at best 15 million Jews in the world, and there are 1.2 billion Catholics, I think, and not alone the number of Christians and Muslims. So we're a small minority. We function differently. But you know that certainly within the Catholic Church, there are there are Polish communities, there are Italian communities, there are those ethnic communities, and a lot of that I think is very important to maintain. But that's a mix of identity, I'll use the term people identity, and religion. Jews, even though we come from many, many different places, we refer to ourselves as a part of the family. So racial, no, not at all. Okay, where are we? And then I'll send you home. 19th century Jewish assimilation was a complex process. Enlightenment, emancipation, the emergence of new ideologies like Zionism. What we're going to see and what we're going to look at next week has to do with the impact of all of this. Because it all looks good on paper, but we realize that it was not effective universally and probably wasn't effective minimally. People attempted to deal with it just like after segregation ended in 1954 in the United States. The way communities have struggled to figure out what is the equitable way to deal with this, as opposed to moving to the suburbs where you don't have to deal with kids who aren't white. Or the idea of how busing took place, where kids were bused out of neighborhoods and whatever. That's reflective of the same dilemma and challenge of how do you live with a multicultural, multiracial society. What we're looking at here is after Jews of 2,000 years are permitted to become part of the society and the culture, it doesn't happen like that. And it doesn't happen easily and simply, and it is full of missteps, mistakes, and it doesn't become what people hope for. So part of the response to it is the creation of what becomes Zionism. The idea being that Jews will never be fully actualized until, in fact, they control their own destiny and have their own country to be able to live in. And that's where we're going to stop tonight and pick up next time. Thank you all for being so...
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
You're here.